Okay, welcome everybody. We're super excited to be joined by the wonderful Nisrin Elamin. Today we are going to be discussing Africa Uprising, our emergency read for Because We've Read about Sudan and the Sudan uprisings. Today actually marks the 1 month anniversary, if you will, of the start of these uprisings across Sudan. And we're here with Because We've Read, which is an international radical book club here to challenge the way you think about the world and your place within it. I'm your host, Hoda Katebi. And we're really excited and honored and blessed to be here with Nisrin. She's an amazing, brilliant Sudanese scholar, activist, writer, PhD candidate in anthropology based in New York City. She has over 15 years of experience working with community-based organizations as an educator, organizer, and advocate. She does really amazing, wonderful things. Her whole bio is on the Juju Azad website, but her dissertation specifically looks at the way Saudi and Emirati land grabs are reconfiguring social relations between the landless communities in Sudan. So she realized, like, her family is in Sudan right now. She was just talking about her father actually being in the protests and being able to connect with him daily. So I think we're really excited to have you here. Welcome. Hi, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And I also just want to give a quick shout out to Razan Idris, who connected me to you, who has this amazing syllabus called Sudan Syllabus. You can follow it on hashtag Sudan Syllabus online to just learn more about our amazing country.
Wonderful, thank you. I am also going to pull up our live chat that we have. So please feel free to engage. Not repeat my pull up voice. Our live chat. Okay, so please, we encourage everybody to join and join the conversation. So if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, if they're relevant currently to what we're discussing, then I'll be able to pull them up immediately. If not, we'll save them to the end or whenever they become relevant if we're planning on talking about them. Everyone's saying hi. Hi. So yeah, Nisrin, thank you so much for being here again. Would you like to just quickly go over what's happening generally in Sudan?
Sure, yeah. So as you mentioned, we're currently in our fourth week of protests, anti-government protests. By some calculations, the protests actually started December 13th in a town called the Damazin. But the ones that really kind of triggered this more widespread uprising in Sudan and kind of had a domino effect started in Atbara, in the northeastern part of the country. Secondary school students went to school and discovered that the price of bread had tripled overnight and organized a protest, which quickly turned into a much larger kind of mobilization of people. Atbara is known to be one of the centers of railroad worker organizing, that during the even during the colonial period was significant, and throughout our post-colonial period as well. And so they're kind of different independent worker formations and students that came together there. And then the protests really spread across the country. Again, this is not about bread. This is one of the things I want to talk about today. It was triggered by this rise in bread prices that were caused really by austerity measures that were recommended by the IMF in November of 2017. Sudan, in trying to position itself to get loans from the IMF, essentially took on these recommendations to eliminate subsidies in food, fuel, etc. And that, of course, led to these rising food prices and other kinds of, and the devaluing of the Sudanese pound led to massive inflation, etc. But to characterize these protests as bread riots is not only wrong, but it's also very dangerous, because it means that we're feeding into the Sudanese government's narrative that this is simply an economic crisis that can be done away with by reintroducing subsidies. When what people have from the very beginning demanded, they were not demanding lower bread prices. They were demanding regime change. They were demanding freedom. dignity. And I think, to me, it's about regime change, but it's also about radical change to a political system that has marginalized the vast majority of Sudanese citizens for decades, and that is, and a really a system that has put elites in place that have been incredibly violent and repressive, and racist, frankly, as well. So I think that's something that I want to highlight.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that quick overview. And I thank you for also underlining that these are not, in fact, bread riots, which is definitely like how the media is portraying all of this. Someone has that comment that says the bread was like the straw that broke the camel's back, ? Is that kind of how would you characterize it? Or is this something that's been sort of ongoing? Have protests arisen before against this current regime?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is true, that the sort of rise in basic commodity prices is the straw that broke the camel's back, for sure. There have been, as the chapter that we read shows, ongoing protests. In the most, I guess, recent period, in 2011, 2012, and 2013, there were similar kinds of protests. There are also ways in which these current protests are a little bit different. The ones prior to this, especially 2011, 2012, came out of kind of student movements in Khartoum. And in this case, I mean, one of the interesting things I just want to mention is that the austerity measures I was talking about were implemented somewhat unevenly across the country. So the smaller towns were sort of more heavily hit by them, and that was purposeful. I think because the Sudanese regime underestimated the ability of smaller towns to mobilize against them. And another thing is that, Sudan has a long history of popular uprisings against military regimes. We've unfortunately been mostly ruled by military regimes since our independence. There have only been very short periods of kind of democratic governments. And so in 1964 and in 1985, there were massive uprisings similar to these, really, that overthrew military regimes. And at that time, trade unions and student movements kind of came together and almost bridged the gap between rural areas and urban areas and demands as well. And I think the key factor there was also that the military kind of switched in support of protesters. That was one of the deciding factors. But the point being that, with these protests, with this long history of protests, there is the Sudanese, this particular regime that came to power in 1989 was really strategic in trying to dismantle trade unions after they came to power. And any type of opposition. The 90s were really a very brutal period in our history. Dissidents were tortured, killed, detained, arrested, etc. And then, of course, over the 30-year period this regime has been in power, there's been incredibly repressive, violent kind of campaigns against communities in Darfur, in the Nuba Mountains, in the Blue Nile areas. And there have also been armed resistance movements in those areas. And so we've seen this kind of 30-year rule that has been incredibly repressive, but also very strategic in making sure that any type of opposition is squashed. So the Khartoum in particular has been really protest-proofed in a lot of ways. Security forces that are around al-Bashir are very loyal to him and are very violent, as we've seen in these current protests. So yeah, so I think there's some differences here in that people are finally able to kind of maybe outmaneuver the regime in terms of mobilizing across all these various scales and kind of aspect, as the book talks about political society, bringing aspects of political society and parts of civil society together.
Definitely. And I want to come back to like how this current set of protests are very different than what came before it. And I want to allude to also a point in the book. If we go to chapter 8, 174 and 175, Zachary writes that there are three main ways that you can basically tell if a protest in Sudan will be successful or not, or three central challenges. The first being the nationalities, so ethnic differences that cause unification to be very difficult. The second being the division, again, as you mentioned, between the country's civil and political societies. And then the third is the role of the military. And so taking these 3 points, how are the last two protests in terms of these, I guess, challenges different, particularly with what's happening today, and how many of these 3 challenges are becoming overcome in what we see today on the ground?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. So, so ethnic divisions, the military, what was the third one?
Political and civil society.
Right, okay.
And also, for people who haven't read, which we will be calling out, if you wouldn't mind also maybe defining what political society is, as Zachary describes in the book, or maybe how you'll be using it to move.
Sure, yeah. So I think, well, I can start with that. I think what political society here refers to is, as opposed to civil society, is the kind of more marginalized groups in the cities of unemployed youth and in rural areas as well, of people who have, you know, I guess we could consider part of the working class, really in our context, the unemployed class, if you will, and that don't have access to some of the privileges that civil society does, that tend to be a little bit more middle class, that tend to be more educated, that tend to have more access to sort of NGOs, et cetera. So I think, you know, in the 2013 protests, as the book points out, political society did come out, and we saw that in sort of peripheral areas of Khartoum, where people were mobilizing outside of social media and sort of on a more sort of grassroots level, and targeting really people, again, portrayed those protests as riots, but they were really strategically targeting certain symbols of the government's kind of repressive mechanisms of power, right? So they were burning petrol stations, because in the 1990s all the way until South Sudan seceded in 2011, I think about $30 billion of oil money poured into Sudan, and none of that, nobody has really benefited from it, you know, apart from the regime and the elites surrounding it, right? So I think that was actually, to me, very symbolic, and yet people were like, oh, these people are rioting. They even called them racialized slurs. These are gangs, as the book points out. So I think we already saw some of that emerging. But at that time, political and civil society didn't really come together fully in the way that it has today. So today you have groups of political society in these more rural areas and in the kind of peripheral urban areas coming together with groups like the Sudan Professionals Union, which is part more, and the Sudan Women's Union, for example, several feminist groups, student groups, really coming together at the same time to demand, the same things, essentially. And I think this time around, the demands are a little bit more explicitly anti-racist as well. And I think some of this has to do with the fact that there's been a racist targeting of Darfurian students who have been protesting in Darfur, but also elsewhere, and a sort of, claim by the regime that these are traitors that are affiliated with armed groups, that they're violent, etc. And so they've been detained, they've been tortured, and people have come out on the streets and said, "You arrogant racists, we are all Darfur." That's one of the chants that I've been hearing. So I think that also goes to show that, this government it's an ethno-nationalist regime that has imposed a kind of monocultural Arabization process on the entire country. And that looks very violent in certain parts of the country. And that violence has been sustained. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with what happened in Darfur, but also has been happening in other areas. And that same violence is now being unleashed against people at the center who have not been exposed to that same sustained level of large-scale violence, for a while. So I think that is also mobilizing people, and as the book points out, kind of creating a political consciousness that is making, I think, more people aware, or more people wanting to demand for a radically different Sudan. For me personally, I would like to see a democratic secular state, something called a new Sudan, which the late John Garang, who was the leader of the South Sudanese People's Liberation Movement, who passed away, unfortunately, was killed, called for, right? It was a radical sort of rethinking of a Sudan where, where certain ethnic groups who have been oppressed for generations would no longer be treated like second-class citizens and subjected to violence and bombing campaigns, etc. So I think that is shifting, and some of that has to do with the fact that Khartoum itself has seen a major demographic shift over the last decade or decades, where you've seen a lot more people from these peripheral areas where there are wars coming to the capital, joining universities. So even something like the University of Khartoum, an institution like that has historically been at the center of a lot of these protests, now looks quite different from the way it did 10 years ago. You have Darfurians, you have people from Kordofan, etc., as student leaders within these movements, and they're actually, I think, also shifting the conversation and the demands as a result.
Mm-hmm. So political and sort of civil society are unified today, and that is making it very distinctly different than the protests that have come before.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, again, I'm not on the ground, but that's what I observe from the outside, and also what I hear from my relatives on the ground. Yeah.
All right, and then how about in relation to the two other major challenges in terms of the military? Where is the military right now in respect to, I guess, their alliances? And then secondly, also, it seems like ethnic, and you mentioned there's like this sort of anti-racism strain that's coming out that I also want to talk about more in a second, but where is this also in terms of the challenges faced by the different ethnicities and ethnic groups that also have challenges coming together in solidarity with each other?
Mm. Yeah, so I mean, let me go to the military. I think, as mentioned, the military has always played a pivotal role in kind of determining the outcome of these protests in our history. So in '64 and in '85, and today, I'm not sure exactly what will happen. Obviously, we've seen a few signs in places outside of Khartoum of police officers and some military sort of rank and file take off their uniforms and join the protesters. We've seen a little bit of that. I wish there was much more, but in the capital, we've seen a much more sort of brutal response from the security forces and NIS, they're called the National Intelligence Services. Again, these are the forces that al-Bashir has cultivated over the last 30 years, really, to kind of protest-proof the capital, and they're very loyal. There have been a few sort of moments where apparently the military prevented the security forces or the police from shooting at protesters. But as we've seen over the last week or so, violence has really escalated. People have been killed on the streets, just, shot at with live ammunition. My own cousin had tear gas, thrown into her house, and she had to wrap up her baby and flee. And so I think, and people have been, security forces have entered hospitals, killed doctors, injured patients, etc. So the violence has really, been incredibly just repressive, and it's escalating, and the military is not switching at this point. In terms of ethnic divisions, I think, again, what people are calling for is radical change. And I think that radical change means that we're looking not only at regime change, but at demanding a kind of new political system that does away with this kind of monocultural project, an interpretation of Islam and kind of Arabization process that has been incredibly violent. And so I think that is bringing different ethnic groups together. I don't want to romanticize that either, because I think part of what has been challenging is that in places like Darfur, if people come out, and people have come out to protest, the reactions historically and today have always been even more violent than in the center. And so people have much more to risk in that sense. And yet they are still coming out. And so, I think in the past there's been a critique, and this is also brought up in the book, of groups like Girifna, the student protests sort of at the center of the 2011-2012 protests, which were primarily drawn from the middle class, of being, privileged in the sense that they promote, that they only used nonviolent tactics because they were able to do so, because they had the privilege to do so, right? So I think that is that's a key factor. And moving forward, I'm going to be interested to see how that kind of comes together more.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I definitely also want to now touch upon this question of violence a little bit. It's mentioned in the book, especially in the intro in the first chapter, sort of about how whenever violence becomes sort of part of a protest, they get dismissed very easily, both by the state in terms of then they get to have racialized terms that are associated with the protesters, and then also people, maybe the international community, will kind of look at it very differently. But then I think the book also does a very good job of talking about a violence that is a constant, that's the violence of the state. So in your opinion, where do you kind of see violence, the role of it right now in these protests, how it is being used by people, whether they're looking for something more, if they're going to move more and more towards violence, if you think, or maybe if they're going to take other routes, and how do you think the state is going to react to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to try to answer it. I think, from what I've observed, the protests have been nonviolent. I think if there's been there've been moments of, people sabotaging or burning government buildings. But again, I think that the symbolism of it is important here, in terms of, a reminder that this is about shifting power, and I think in terms of, the response from the state, it has been incredibly violent. There hasn't been any efforts to listen to the demands of the protesters. And because it's a military regime, they have all the mechanisms through which to be violent, whereas the people don't, right? So, there's, I think the one thing that people have been able to do is to just mobilize more and more people as a way of kind of protecting each other and themselves. One of the things that happened in some of the last rounds of protests, including the one my father, who's 81 years old, joined. It was a protest that was meant to reach, and I think it did ultimately reach the presidential palace to kind of present a list of demands, including that the regime step down. And the security forces attacked people with live ammunition and tear gas as they were trying to get to the palace. So people kind of went into these side streets and into the homes of people for protection. They were ducking into people's homes. And then just 2 days ago, my mother said that the security forces were just knocking on people's doors in her neighborhood and just walking in, pulling young people out and putting them on the back of pickup trucks to arrest them, right? I think estimates are that close to 2,000 people have been arrested, including leaders of, prominent professional unions, including the Sudanese Women's Union, all these, different student groups. But the protests have, I think, reached such a massive scale that these arrests can still not really, have not managed to actually, make the protests kind of die down, right? They've almost just added more fuel to the fire, if you will. Like my cousin's neighborhood, where the tear gas ultimately made people in that block, in those few blocks of the neighborhood, go out onto the streets and protest. They weren't before, they supported the protests, but they had, for a variety of reasons, had been staying at home. And then they got attacked like that, and everybody went out, So, I think, again, they're underestimating the power of people to mobilize, and also their tactics are clearly not working,
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Thank you for that. And also, I kind of want to talk about a little bit more about who's on the ground. So you've mentioned that there's a lot of unification, a lot of people are coming out, and that's kind of what makes these protests especially special. But would you mind breaking down a little bit, like who's out there, who's actually marching, and what is there a unification, like are unified demands? Are people demanding many different things, or is the sort of like radical like change kind of the central demand of all of these?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just to kind of recap there, I think so far the protests have reached at least 15 of our 18 states, towns, villages, small cities across the country. And while I think most of the media focus has been on Khartoum, there have been ongoing protests in other towns as well, in the east, in the north, southern part of the country, western part of everywhere really. So I think that's, again, one thing, and in a sustained fashion, which means that you have, in the parts of the country, the Gezira, which is right south of Sudan, it's like was once one of the largest managed irrigation schemes in the world, used by the British to extract cotton. That area, there are a lot of farmers who have come out. And one of the things that's interesting about the smaller towns in Sudan is that, as I mentioned earlier, the Bashir regime has really systematically tried to dismantle trade unions and farmers unions and made sure that they co-opt kind of local governing bodies, right? So any small kind of positions, mayors, etc., are always co-opted by the regime. But that doesn't mean that people haven't formed alternative kind of unions or haven't organized outside of those spaces. In fact, that's part of what I study, is looking at these kind of more independent farmer union formations and other kinds of worker formations that are organizing sometimes underground, because they've been also, lots of people have been arrested as a result of these activities. And so those people are out on the streets. I mean, really everybody's out on the streets is the answer to this question, but I think, again, and I would say people who in the previous rounds of protests perhaps were not as motivated to come out, in part because of the economic hardships, but also because people have just reached a point where they're just fed up. 30 years is enough. And it's like, there is no people, there's, what else are they going to lose, really? Right. So I think that there's that sentiment. And I think that goes across classes. Of course, the working class, the unemployed, poor, have been hit much harder than everybody else. But that group has also been growing. And so, yeah, I think it's really across, from professors to, railroad workers to farmers to secondary school youth. A lot of young people are out on the streets, and they're really quite instrumental to the way these protests have grown. So even beyond university students, you have a lot of high school students at the forefront too, which is really inspiring. And they've lived under this regime all their life. They don't know anything but this regime, and they want change. And so I think the demands are pretty united from what I've heard. They're demanding freedom, dignity, peace, and regime change. That's the main thing that everybody's asking for, is regime change and a transition, a democratic kind of transition, elections, free elections. This regime, the parliament recently approved a constitutional change that would allow al-Bashir to run again in 2020, which is partly what people are angry about. Yeah. So, I think a big demand is for the legal system to fundamentally change in order to prevent something like this from happening again, and to really make sure that, since our independence, we've had these elites come to power, and they're mostly drawn from three ethnic groups that have kind of that are also affiliated with an economic elite. So we have these elites in power since independence, and that is partly because the legal framework allows them to do that, has allowed them to do that, right? And so if we don't change the constitution and the legal system, then that can continue to happen in the future as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. This I mean, this is like a good ending question, but someone brought it up and it's really relevant now. Kind of on the question of like, where are people directing this? And you're mentioning these reforms or radical change. Muhammad El Saib asks, what is the ideal endgame in the situation? The phrase radical change is mentioned often, but are there politicians, parties ready and willing to fill the void besides the old guard?
That is a great question. I don't know if I have the full answer to this, but I think this is one of our worries, right? Is like, if we look at protests that have happened elsewhere in Africa, sometimes they've led to similar scenarios after a transition period, right? So obviously we are fearful of that. People are deeply skeptical of the kind of opposition parties that have often that sort of belong to the old guard, that are part of the elite, if you will, that have also often made compromises with this regime that are in some ways unforgivable. So I think that is one of the things that is of big concern, is that there aren't that many alternatives. I think there are efforts, the Sudanese Communist Party. I mean, there are some parts of the opposition that are a little bit more popular and kind of grassroots, if you will, that could potentially fill that void. I think the main demand right now is for this regime to go and for there to be a transition period and for there to be, for people to have a say, right? I think that is the kind of first step. What happens after that, I don't feel qualified to even speak to, because I think that's something for people inside Sudan to determine and to kind of lay out in terms of what the options should be for people. But I think right now the demand is we need options. We need the ability to participate in this, kind of shaping the political change that we're asking for. And again, I want to mention this New Sudan vision. If anybody's interested to kind of learn more about it, John Garang laid it out in the 2000s around a country that, a vision of a country that is democratic, that is secular, that reminds me a little bit of the kind of one-state solution in Palestine, if you will, right? That really addresses the ways that this regime has been incredibly racist, and that has pitted, kind of used ethnic divisions to really stay in power, and to kind of pit people against each other in order to maintain its grip on power.
And where can we go to read that?
I'll send you some links later. Yeah, because it's.
All right, we'll add it to the post.
Yeah.
Thank you for addressing that challenging question. I think this is actually a question that I feel like a lot of people are asked when sort of in a state of uprising. It's sort of like, are you sure whatever is going to come is going to be better than what is currently present? I've heard that a lot when it comes to Syria, for example, right now. And I think it definitely almost like undermines the people on the ground who are angry enough to protest. And that I agree with you in that, both of us, especially not me, can speak to this. But also at the same time, you don't necessarily have to have the exact vision of what you're going to do after if you know what's working right now isn't working. So I definitely.
Yeah. And I think there is also something to be said about the incredible, like what happens, and again, the book addresses this quite well, I think, when something like this produces or allows people to have a different imagination of the future, right? That sort of shifts our political imagination to think about what is possible, even potentially outside of this kind of idea of the nation state, of a kind of democratic, governing structure that is colonial in certain ways, right? So I think also I want to caution us against thinking that a transition to a kind of multi-party system or multi-party elections, and that the kind of current political party system is necessarily what is possible, right? I think the possibilities are somewhat endless, if you will, and I think for people to know that after 30 years, like if whoever, let's say somebody else comes to power who is repressive or autocratic, what's important to me is that they know that a popular uprising just overthrew the people before them, right? I think that is important to me. Like, it's important for people to know you can't just do whatever you want. People are gonna push against it, even if you have military might. The people ultimately have the power, and I think that's that to me is because I think the government is scared at the moment. It's very clear. Otherwise, they wouldn't be using the tactics that they've been using, and that's important, for them to feel that fear.
Definitely, and I love that. That's very beautiful sentiment. Actually, to quote on page 175 of the book, he writes, Sudanese rulers are right to remain fearful of a broad-based, truly popular movement, so they work feverishly to fend off the latest round of would-be revolutionaries. So it's definitely something that's like a threat, and like good that it is a threat.
Yeah, exactly.
I also want to talk about race, and I want to talk about gender. So you've been mentioning racism a lot. Would you mind breaking that down a little bit? You've mentioned something about sort of a centralization of specifically like Arab elite power, as well as Darfur. Just quickly give the lay of the land in terms of like where is this racism? What does it look like on the ground? And how does this, almost where did it come from? In like a quick few minutes.
Yeah, it's a hard one to do justice, I think, especially as someone from Northern Sudan. But I will say that I think there are very historical roots to the current system. So, like, for example, during colonialism, or I guess right at independence, Sudan got its independence in 1956. 800 sort of administrative seats were left open by the British when they left. And I also want to say they left because there was anti-colonial resistance. It wasn't just like okay, bye, So they left, 800 seats open, and only 6 of them went to South Sudan, and 1 went to Darfur. And Darfur here is the size of like Texas, so we're talking about a very large area, populous area, and so what happened as a result is that basically power has always been concentrated in the hands of a few ethnic groups at the center of the country. And the system has developed in a way to profit the center at the expense of the periphery. And now there is some that I could problematize the center periphery metaphor here, but we don't. For purposes of this conversation, what I'll say is that vast areas of the country in the kind of periphery, Darfur, and continue to be Darfur, Blue Nile, southern Kurdistan in general, north and south, have been marginalized, in terms of the development of the country. So you have, a kind of, in terms of the infrastructure, lack of education, healthcare, services, etc. There's very little, right, in those parts of the country, and so people very early in Darfur, for example, there was a movement of, led by intellectuals that demanded political representation in government from the 1960s onwards. So that demand has been there for a very long time. And again, I don't have time to sort of go through the history of what happened in Darfur, but suffice it to say that after the government started attacking people in Darfur, those demands, continued to be present, and armed resistance groups formed because they were not listened to. There had been decades of neglect and, basically an unwillingness to shift or change the political system in a way that would allow other groups of people to be represented and for their demand, for their needs to be met. And that didn't happen. So, yeah, I think, and there's also been a long process of forced kind of Arabization, an imposition of, even in terms of the way that Sudan thinks of its history, a real, in the education system, very few people learn about the true history of Sudan and its relationship to the rest of the Sahel and West Africa. There's lots of very strong ties. Even our anti-colonial movements were tied to support from West Africans, and we never hear about that in our histories. And so I think there's also a lack of consciousness around, Sudan being a very important country in the history of Africa because of the way that the elites have thought of themselves as Arab, as an Arab country. It's complicated, so I'm kind of hesitant to really delve into it. But hopefully that kind of starts to answer some of your question.
Definitely.
Yeah, in terms of gender, Sudan also has a very long history of feminist organizing and movements, starting really during the colonial period. There's a Sudan women's movement that began in the 1940s under a group called the Sudan Women's Union, which still exists today. And, there are different people, Samia Nagar and Mira Usman, who write about this, if people are interested in learning more about the feminist movement in Sudan. But they've been very instrumental in the 1960s in fighting for women's rights to vote and to sort of participate in the political life, in equal pay for women. There was a critique then that the demands of the women's movement were bourgeois, that they were focused so much on sort of middle class demands around work, and neglected other kinds of women's rights. And I think that critique somewhat persisted, but I think some of that has also changed. And I think there was a sort of coming together of feminist and more socialist elements as well in our history. And so currently there are several members of the Sudan Women's Union that have been leading and participating in these protests that have been detained and arrested. So they're still active. There are lots of the student groups are led by women. Lots of the youth movements are led by women. And I think central to the demands of people within those groups is gender justice and kind of a shift of the way that we think about women's role in society. So I think that's, again, I would encourage people to look at Razan's Sudan syllabus for that as well. I think she has some great entries on that, and Samia Nagar's work as well.
Definitely. And Razan's syllabus is linked in the Jujazad post, and we'll definitely get those other links from Nisrin and add them to the post as well. Now, in our last 15 minutes, again, if anyone wants to ask any other additional questions, we have one more that I'll add in a moment. But I want to take a step a little bit back and look at sort of the larger, both Pan-African, but then also like the role of the international community and what's happening right now. Where is Sudan's influence right now in terms of like other African countries looking at what's happening in Sudan right now? I know there has been violence that's erupted across Zimbabwe, for example, recently. Do you feel like this is in conversation with other things happening? And then also the international community, where are they? Where are they?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, there've also been recent elections in the Congo that, people feel like have been co-opted. And there's a lot of parallels, I would say, between the Congo and Sudan in terms of the way that multinational interests have played a role in resource extraction and the way that those partnerships have propped up the regime as well. And so maybe I'll start there in terms of the role of the international community. It's been interesting for me to see how people, so there's been obviously a lot of silence around what has happened, what is happening on the ground in Sudan, really in the international media. And when it is covered, as we mentioned, these protests are being described often as bread riots, which is very dangerous. But one of the things that people don't mention is the fact that the United States has played a very pivotal role in allowing the Bashir regime to kind of stay in power. Really, since the Obama administration, there's been a kind of thawing of the relationship between al-Bashir and the United States that led to, in October of 2017, to Sudan to be removed from the list of sanctions were lifted that really had started during the Clinton era, and for Sudan to be lifted from the travel ban list as well. And that came about because Sudan was sending troops, continues to send troops to the war in Yemen to fight on the side of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. They're sort of sending soldiers because the Saudis and Emiratis don't want to risk putting their own soldiers on the line. And in return for that, the Emiratis and Saudis have lobbied on Sudan's behalf, which again got, as I mentioned, Sudan removed from the travel ban list. So what that's meant is that even this lifting of sanctions, and not all sanctions were removed, but the specific sanctions that were removed have allowed for there to be U.S. money coming into Sudan that is tied to multinational interests, right? So I study Saudi and Emirati investments in land. They've put, billions of dollars, pumped billions of dollars into leasing land for agribusiness, close to, I think, from my latest calculations, 3 billion acres of land in Sudan that is now under kind of foreign hands. And so all of these things play a role, right? Because silence, can be interpreted by people who don't know about this as, oh, they just don't care, our lives don't matter. But there's also something very purposeful about that, which is that, like in the Congo, they don't want us to know what's happening because they want to continue, furthering their own economic and political interests. And the European Union has actually been funding the Sudanese regime, I think to the tune of 250 million or so through something called the Khartoum process, which started in the kind of 2015, I think, around then. And basically what they've been doing is they've been funding these militias along the border with Libya and Egypt to basically stem migration from East Africa, right, from the Horn to Europe. So they've been reconceptualizing the northern Sudanese border as Europe's southernmost border. Wow. And so that's, I think, key as well, because these security forces are some of the same ones that are now violently attacking protesters in Khartoum. It's the same kind of apparatus, right? 70% of our budget in Sudan has been spent on the military. That's, again, one of the key demands of these protests, is to really shift the way that our money is spent, right? And that, essentially because of that disproportionate amount of money going to the military, the government has gutted the education system. It's gutted the healthcare system. There are no jobs. It's basically, they've completely mismanaged the economy. So all of these things go hand in hand. We have a police state, and as a result, a complete dismantling of the welfare state, right? Those things go hand in hand, as in the United States, right? So I think, that's key. I think it's important for us. I think it's incumbent upon us as people who pay taxes or whatever to really know what role the international community has been playing in propping up the Bashir regime, even if they say, things like, oh, it's a dictatorship, whatever. Ultimately, their actions speak much louder than this kind of silence in the media, right?
Definitely. And in terms of other protests across Africa right now and their relationship, I also want to come back to that point, though, in terms of sort of the international community, because we do have chapters. We have one from Birmingham, UK right now. Their whole chapter is watching live. I guess they're kind of pulling out of the EU, but still, we do have people around also how they can support and just joining their local protests. So conversation on what's happening, like a Pan-African perspective, looking at other countries right now, and then we'll go to our final question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the book points this out very well, is that there is this kind of third wave of protests, right? Like we had, my partners from Burkina Faso, and there was a successful coup, or a popular uprising, there, that didn't necessarily lead to the outcome that people wanted, but there has been this kind of wave across the continent. What we're seeing, in Zimbabwe and the Congo right now is, again, that even when you have these kind of popular uprisings, oftentimes, the outcome might not be what is the essential thing for us to look at, right? I think that's, again, going back to our conversation about political imagination. I think from a Pan-African perspective, again, I want to emphasize this idea that perhaps it's time for us to think beyond the boundaries of the nation state and the kind of constructs that has been that has colonial roots, to think more about how is it that we can mobilize across the continent, because people have very similar demands, right? That again are rooted in our kind of joint histories of colonialism and neocolonialism and neoliberalism. So I think there's, this is Sudan is. This is an Islamist regime, but it's been very neoliberal at the same time, very much about gutting the public sector and privatizing sectors that in and of themselves, that process has been violent as well. And I think that is something that has happened across the continent. So yeah, I think, I'm not an expert. I don't want to speak on it too much further, but I think it is important for us to think about then, as ordinary African citizens, how do we look across the continent if we think of ourselves as people who are not bound by these kind of artificial borders, right? How do we then engage with each other in a way that can amplify our voices and our power and our demands?
That's beautiful. And I hope that that everything's kind of moving toward that direction as we see continued unification in Sudan, let that spread globally even. I think we have obviously incredibly similar problems in the Middle East in terms of kind of arbitrary borders drawn also primarily by the British and European powers. So I think your ideas of what a future could look like are very beautiful and inspiring. I also want to ask a question now at this time in terms of just news coverage. Why do you think that everything has kind of been silent up until a little bit now recently? You mentioned that press is a little bit picking up now. Michael Fawaz asked the question, how do we get this into the mainstream? What outlets are even covering the situation?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think this is actually really important. So I want to just make sure that I mention to people who are listening where I get my news from, right? So recently, the Sudanese Translators for Change just put up a Facebook page that is in English that kind of updates, what is happening. There's a Reddit thread called Revolution of the Hungry that people can look up that basically updates not only what is happening, but with links to reports on it in English. So that's a place that people can look at. I listen to Radio Dabanga, which comes out of it's linked, outside of the country, but it comes out of Darfur, and it's like a live radio program. Sudan Tribune has some good op-eds and news as well. Follow Garifna and Sudan Change Now online. I think the reason we're seeing a little bit more coverage now is not only because of the escalating violence. Just a couple of days ago, a doctor was killed along with a 14-year-old patient of his, I believe. And so the reason things have shifted is because people on the ground are mobilizing and organizing to get the stories out. And, anytime I get a media request in, I try to delegate it out to people on the ground. There are lots of people who are working sort of behind the scenes, if you will, and in front of the scenes, people like Yusra al-Bagher, Ismail Kushkush. There's lots of people in the diaspora who have been who've been working around the clock really to get these stories out there. The media tends to be quite lazy in terms of putting the same people in front of our screens. Oftentimes, for some reason, we get like a white analyst from Oxford who sits in between, two Sudanese.
A number of times they had a non-Iranian who couldn't speak Farsi, Iranian expert, talk about nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and I think the problem with that is that, again, then we miss an opportunity here to talk to a young person who's participating in the protests, who can analyze what is going on the ground much, much better than somebody who's sitting at Oxford, whether Sudanese or not, who can analyze it much better than I can because I'm not there, right? So I think that's an important aspect of this, is like, let's amplify the voices of people that are there, that are experiencing this uprising on a day-to-day basis, that are out on the streets, that are risking their lives. They know why they're there. They have a very nuanced political analysis of what is happening. And and they can talk about their own visions of the future in a way that can then also be heard and amplified, right? And the regime needs to know that people are watching. So I think this is, for me, this is my motivation to kind of keep demanding that the international media cover this, that, we don't need people to come in and overthrow the regime, right? I mean, again, maybe other people feel differently about this, but what we do need is coverage. We need denouncements from the international community of the ways that the response to these protests is being dealt with, right? And the violence, the state violence that is being unleashed against us. There needs to be a much, much stronger response from the United Nations. They've given like a couple of, I don't know, like maids, yeah, whatever that never does anything, right? Like, but I mean, so I think I think the media can play a very significant role, and people can play a role too in supporting these movements. Tweet about what is happening in Sudan. Let people know in your own communities that there's an uprising that has been going on for over a month, and that the response has been incredibly violent. Listen to what people on the ground are saying in terms of material support and other kinds of media support that people are looking for, and try to get involved if you can. Again, always, I think, I guess recognizing that it's up to people in Sudan to determine what our role should be, even for those of us in the diaspora. It's not up to us to decide how we should be involved. But there are calls, there are, demands for people to get involved, and we can respond to those.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. You answered my very last question. So what is that call to action? And I've heard that a lot from many people on the ground and diaspora, is that there just really needs to be a signal boost right now. So people who have platforms and people who just even don't, just being able to like talk about it, use hashtags, contribute, not necessarily contribute their own 2 cents, obviously, but uplifting the voices of people who are on the ground.
Yeah, like I saw even, just shout out to like people like J. Cole, who happens to have someone in his inner circle who's like a Sudanese hip hop artist. That makes a difference. Like the people, I mean, for me, that's one of my main goals, is to also use these kinds of moments as opportunities to build solid, sort of solidarity across, like among people of color, right? And for us to realize that really the same apparatus or mechanisms that are being used against people at our own borders, right, are the same ones that are being used and being supported in Sudan. So there are lots of parallels, and even this question of what is happening in Yemen. We need to be pushing the U.S. government much harder around withdrawing its support for the war in Yemen, and that inadvertently will also support and the demands of Sudanese people, right? So these things are all connected. Yeah.
Definitely, yeah. And on that point of connection too, another reason why I highly recommend people read this book if they haven't already, especially if you're part of Because We've Read, is there's just so many connections to other things that we've read so far, just scattered throughout the pages. Specifically, we just read about policing, abolition, and prisons, and I think that has such a strong connection to sort of this colonial and post-colonial rule in Africa. And how policing in the United States is kind of modeled off of that, and vice versa. So especially on like the second chapter, a lot of the conversations about how sort of society is organized in terms of like these distinct ways of dividing and conquering populations, as well as sort of this visualizations of cleanliness, and sort of like taking away the urban poor and being able to then exert violence on them because they sort of a visualization of poverty. And so I think there's so many ties just in the ways that not only that sort of society is being organized, both like across the world and what's happening right now as a legacy in Sudan, but also a lot of the times we see police forces actually getting trained or training the military abroad. And so there are very direct links as well, beyond just funding, that there's between a lot of the issues that we have globally.
Yeah, I've actually heard reports of Russian operatives being on the ground and sort of working hand in hand with the security forces during these protests, which is not surprising, but I also want to just mention a couple of books or people to read. So I mentioned earlier that Atbara was the place where these protests, they didn't start there, they started in Damazin, but that protest kind of had that domino effect that spread quickly across 23 cities after Atbara. And there's a book called City of Steel and Fire by Ahmed Sikainga, which I'd really highly recommend if people want to learn more about sort of union and worker sort of organizing and mobilizing in Sudan. We talked earlier about the new Sudan, and John Garang has both spoken about this in his speeches and written about it. But there are also several Sudanese scholars that I just want to highlight, South Sudanese scholars. Jok Madut Jok is somebody that I think, can speak to some of the historical, the sort of, when I talk about radical change, his scholarship, I think, speaks to the historical roots of the, I guess, the how do I put this, of what is kind of what needs to be radically changed about our political system, right? That goes beyond just this regime. So I want to just highlight him. Francis Deng has also written about, I think he's touched upon the new Sudan as well, I believe. And then Amir Idris also, he's at Fordham. He's written about just violence and sort of racism in the state in Sudan. There's lots of others, but I think that might be a good place to start. And again, the Sudan syllabus, I think, gives more detail on this.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're definitely going to get the links and names and spell that all out on the blog post so people can have that if they weren't able to write that fast. But thank you so much again, Nisrin, for joining us and being a part of this conversation and teaching us so much. Everyone has really also been mentioning how much they've felt this conversation was very insightful, and they really appreciate you for being here. So thank you so much. And if you haven't had the chance, please do read this book, or at least check out the additional resources, and I'll be also adding to that list all of Nisrin's suggestions she just now gave as well. We'll be reading this through the end of January, and February we'll go back to our 2-month units. We have a really exciting guest as well next month. So yeah, thank you guys so much for being here and joining and wanting to be a part of this conversation and support. That's all.
Thanks for having me.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.